While the ongoing forum is attended by top government leaders, among whom is Indonesian President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, he sees government as vital in effecting change in people and in countries, including his own. Ara Perez tells us more.
Indonesian President Susilo Yudhoyono urged the government to be a catalyst of change through working for social mobility. Speaking before the crowd in the World Economic Forum East Asia held at the Makati Shangri-La, the Indonesian president believes social mobility should be enjoyed by all parts of society, adding that a pro-poor, pro-job, and pro-environment administration is key to equality and to action. In a generation blessed with the means to respond to poverty and conflict, Yudhoyono cited education as a factor in social mobility and as the best means to fight poverty, abolishing tuition increase and offering rates at a modest amount, mainly for the poor. In response to this, Indonesia released $11 million worth of microcredit loans offered to residents at a low rate of 4%. Yudhoyono also believes in the potential of small and large-scale entrepreneurship, citing a 75 million job generation target for the next decade. The government has allotted more than $26 billion for infrastructure, including electricity and telecommunications, set to be released come 2015 to 2017. Meanwhile, Yudhoyono praised the Philippines for being the new tiger economy of Asia, saying that the decision to hold the forum in the country was a vote of confidence among leaders in the region. Indonesia has a projected economic growth of 2.2 to 4.4 trillion by 2030, with an expected poverty rate dip from 18% to 9.3%. For the People's Television, this is Ara Perez.
Thank you, Ara Perez. Now we bring you back to Makati Shangri-La Hotel Bacolod Room for the Rethinking Economic Growth session.
Managing Director of Markets in the Asia Pacific for Jones Lang LaSalle. He is a fellow resident of Hong Kong. And to my immediate left, Mr. Naoyuki Shinohara, the Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. Directly in front of me, Ms. Shinta Wijaya Kamdani, the Chief Executive Officer of Syntesa Group in Jakarta, and also a member of the Global Agenda Council for Southeast Asia. I'm Wayne Arnold. I'm the Asia Economics Correspondent at the Wall Street Journal in Hong Kong. So let's get started. We'll go around the room. I think we should start with Professor Fu Jun. Professor, tell us what is wrong with the approach we've had. Have we put too much emphasis on GDP as an indicator of progress? And how do we achieve a better, balanced, and more sustainable growth model going forward?
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity. A bit of the work we've done for the new growth model. It's a part of the Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum. The way we approach that question is we look at existing models. Well, at the risk of simplification, we look at the standard textbook model of growth. Growth is a function of land, labor, capital. It's a standard growth model. And under that model, you can think of two modes. One is extensive mode of development. The other is intensive mode of development. So we begin by identifying holes and the gaps in the existing model. And what we found is now if you sort of go systematically by looking at that model in the variable of land, the practice of that model has not been sensitive enough to the carrying capacity of the earth. In other words, we need to have better mechanisms to balance resources, given the economic principles of prices a function of scarcity. If we move on from that variable to labor, you're talking about a human capital. It seems to us there are many labor-saving technologies instead of technology progress, but not enough earth-saving technologies. So there is a hole there, a gap there. And in the variable of capital, if not theoretically, but in practice, if the return rates of capital is systematically higher than real economic growth rates, then the model cannot be sustained. Or if the growth rates of highly leveraged investment is systematically higher than real return rates of capital, the model cannot be sustained. But either way, it's a case of inflation, and in the case of inflation, secretive and a powerful way of transfer of wealth.
Okay.
And the result being, you see a widening gap between rich and poor. It's a question not just domestically, but internationally. So another gap that we see is now, if you look at a standard model, that model looks Einstein, very mechanical. It's not sensitive to the field. And there we are talking about institutions. Now, if you have really level playing ground, you can gain in terms of allocative efficiency. So in that report, we have a special chapter on institutional learning and institutional innovation. So this is the sort of diagnosis we have of the existing model. Now, we come up with a new model. I quote new here. But as a tool of communication, effective communication, I would call our new model a give model, a model that gives. G stands for green, I stands for inclusiveness, V stands for value. We need to have a change of mindset. Growth is not only about efficiency, it's also about equity, fairness. Well, if you talk about human well-being, you're talking about health, education, employment, political freedom, social relationship, environmental quality and security. And E, give the last term, E stands for ecosystem. And we need to build a better ecosystem to promote entrepreneurship and innovation at the micro level, and more at the macro level. We need to better calibrate the role of state or global governance, for the same matter, vis-a-vis the role of the marketplace. Because in terms of the environment, it's a public good, and we need to have a hierarchy, a better global governance to deal with externalities. And what do we have? But we have a report out early this year in the annual Davos meeting there. So I guess I have to stop here.
Please, we'll come back to you.
Okay.
Shinohara-san, can I turn to you? Can you elaborate a little bit more on sustainability, both in terms of the inequities of incomes we've seen, in terms of the environmental sustainability? How has GDP as a measure failed us?
Well, as we all know, GDP is a very, how do I put it, wonderful, delicate set of indexes that covers a whole range of economic indicators. But of course, it has its own limitations. For example, it doesn't measure the transactions that are not through the market mechanism, like household work that doesn't go out of the house. It is not measured in the GDP. How the income is distributed is not the issue to the GDP. That is not included. As Dr. Fujin says, environmental degradation, so-called externalities are not in the GDP. So GDP has its own limitations, but GDP is still a very elegant instrument to measure how the economy is working. From the IMF viewpoint, we work on GDP mainly, but if you look at programs in Europe, after the European financial crisis, we have had several programs in Europe. And increasingly, the issue of social inclusion, the issue of unemployment, the issue of income inequality is a big issue in order to make the program successful. When in the program, we talk about fiscal consolidation, we talk about monetary tightening, but it has certainly impacts on the people, especially on the poorer section of the society. And that is why there are huge demonstrations in the countries, and that makes it very difficult for the program to go through. And that is why the program design has to be very carefully calibrated in order to measure the impacts of those macroeconomic policies on the poorer section of the economy. So the program includes lots of measures for social protection and things like that. So the issue of social inclusion, the issue of inequality is part of our agenda now in order to make the economic growth sustainable So it is not just the GDP, but other measures that we need to take into account in our activities as well.
Let's come back to you on that issue as well. Nandu, let me ask you about this. You have often talked, and Nestle has often talked about the real costs that need to be factored in of resources. Can you address this when it comes to sustainability and equitable growth?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. You've often talked about the real cost of resources, particularly water. Can you talk about how that fits in the debate about sustainability and equitable growth?
Okay, I'll be happy to talk about that. Let's first start with some of the concepts that Fu Jun and Shinohara-san already introduced. This whole conference is focused on the theme of inclusive growth, where we need to move GDP is elegant, but we need to move beyond that to other measures along health, education, employment, Millennium Development Goals, and so on. Now, one of the fundamental, and this of course has responsibilities for all stakeholders, government, industry, and so on. One of the fundamental beliefs in Nestle of the way we approach business is that the only way we can sustainably create value for our shareholders, and the word sustainably is very important. The only way we can sustainably create value for our shareholders is if we simultaneously create value for the society in which we operate. It includes all stakeholders. In the case of Nestle, if I refer back then to some of the themes that Fu Jun touched upon, and then I'll come to your sustainability point. Fu Jun touched upon the theme of employment, health, and education. Let's talk about these three themes. In the case of Nestle, we focus what we call our creating shared value efforts on rural development, on water, and on nutrition. Why these three? First, rural development. What people tend to overlook is when it comes to employment as a measure of inclusive growth, 90% of all employment in the world is created by the private sector. And one of the largest employers in the world is the rural agriculture sector. In ASEAN, something like 37% of people are employed in the agriculture sector. Nestle, as a food and beverage company, has a natural linkage back into the farm. We work directly with 700,000 directly who get paid on a daily basis and have cash transfers on a daily basis. And that's the best way to provide them a livelihood, provide them sustainability, education to make sure they improve productivity and income, and eventually the dignity that allows them to live a full life. So that's a huge pillar of how we work. Let me talk about nutrition, then I come to sustainability and water. Nutrition is core to Nestle, and it's part of our DNA. Now, if I go to the measures of inclusive growth and health, for instance, one of the a few facts. Today we have something like 1.5 billion people, particularly in the subtropical belt, who are malnourished, where you have stunting rates in children of the order of 35 to 40%. And this is a public health crisis that is shameful, which can be prevented simply by addressing micronutrient deficiencies and macronutrient deficiencies. And this is something we in Nestle are able to help government by fortification of our products, removing the bad stuff, the sugar, the salt, the trans fatty, saturated, and adding some of the good stuff, the micronutrient deficiencies that are really required by these populations. And we have, for instance, something like 200 million servings a day of fortified products sold only in West Africa, which help to alleviate some of the micronutrient deficiencies in population, whether it's iron or zinc or iodine or vitamin A. The other burden of disease is the obesity and non-communicable disease crisis. And again, it's ironical that you have 1.5 billion people who are overweight or obese, and these numbers are rising. The fastest growing disease we have in society is diabetes. And this is a very important measure of inclusive growth. How do we cope with health? This requires science, it requires an understanding of nutrition science, human physiology, it requires educating stakeholders, governments, opinion leaders, civil society, consumers, and it requires a complete reformulation of the kind of products that are offered to society. And that's a huge area that we work in. Then I come to water, which was the question that you raised. The world, I heard a startling statistic 2 days ago in the Grow Asia Forum, which I was co-chairing. In the next 40 years, simply to cope with the increase in population, today 7 billion going to 9.5 billion by 2050, in the next 40 years, the world has to produce as much food as we have produced in the last 4,000 years. Let's think about that. The next 40 years, as much food as the last 4,000 years. Yeah. For many reasons, we basically need to double our production of food on an annual basis between now and the year 2050. What do you need for food production? Well, akin to the economics model, the growth model put forward, you need land. We aren't making any more of it. In fact, we're degrading it. We need sunshine. There's plenty of that around. We need people, and we need water. And these are the two scarce resources. People, because children of farmers don't want to be farmers. Farmers don't want their children to follow them simply because of lack of sustainability and the high risk nature of the entire agricultural model, smallholder farm model that exists today. But water, 70% of all the fresh water used by mankind is used for agriculture, to grow food. Today, already as mankind, we use fresh water which is 10% in excess of the replenishment level. So we're tapping into aquifers that have been built over millennia. The forecast is that by 2030, we as mankind, to grow food, will be using fresh water at a rate that is 60% higher than replenishment levels. So survived for millennia without iron, without silicon, and without oil and carbon. We can't survive more than 2 days without water. And yet we are looking at a scenario where over the next 30 years, the most precious commodity in the world will be water.
So pricing and access will become huge political issues. They already are.
To start with, sustainability is the first issue. To make sure that water use is sustainable in order to produce the kind of food so we can feed the world and we have food security. Not only food security, to go back to the previous point of the double burden of disease, we have nutrient security in the right measure in the right place. And to produce that, we need really to very closely create a multi-stakeholder engagement platform to make sure the use of water resources is sustainable. And that's one of the key platforms, the 3 platforms I mentioned: rural development, nutrition, and water, that Nestle works part of our Creating Shared Value program to make sure that we create value for society, and that's the only way we can sustainably create value for our shareholders.
Let me come back to you then on how you can apply that in some of the countries in this region. Jeremy, let me turn to you. We're on the subject of sustainability, and you talked about some of the human rights of water and nutrients being one of them. You mentioned land specifically. Jeremy, what's been happening in that space, and how is that contributing to the increasing disparities of income and the unequal levels of growth we're seeing in the region? Access to property.
Jones Lang LaSalle are a property advisory company, so we advise on various elements related to the built environment primarily. And I think that within the industry as a whole, what we have been endeavouring to do is to greenify, for want of a better word, the built environment. 30% of carbon emissions globally come from buildings, and therefore, from that perspective, we are the development are looking very closely at how to measure their impact, and so there is a significant push from governments as climate change is being acknowledged as being a big issue, to work out how one can do that efficiently. How do we make sure that we take that carbon footprint down within the built environment? Within the workplace, you're finding a lot of individuals, especially the younger generation, are wanting a more productive workplace. So from their point of view, there's a interesting, I was at a conference last week where talking about wellness and very much related to the human capital piece, we're getting to a point now where obviously sitting at work is perceived as one of the issues related to obesity and such like. People are now having desks that you stand up. Well, actually in America you've got desks with treadmills, and they are fixed at 4 kilometers an hour.
This is why we're in the round here. So
yeah, exactly.
As
soon as we get up, that's. So I think from that point of view, the real estate industry is endeavouring to make sure that both from a development standpoint and from an occupational standpoint, that one is aware of it, and it's being driven both from a government standpoint but also from an investor standpoint. The reality is, as we go forward, as more regulation is provided in this area, the reality between those buildings that cannot provide that sort of sustainable measurement versus those that can are going to see, I think, in due course, a premium. And so that you start to find that those impositions are being put in, and it's important that there's strong governance from that point of view at a political level, so that you understand exactly what you do and where you may be able to, as I say, get benefits as a consequence of that.
Okay. Shinta, I have to turn to you on Indonesia then, because this is obviously the largest region, one of the most important, and obviously one of the most challenging environmental problems and sustainability problems. And as I mentioned, even though its Gini coefficient is better than Thailand's, it's by no means considered, I think, acceptable. How would you address this issue?
Well, first of all, I think the timing, right? If you see 2015 is last year of the UN MDG, as mentioned, and also at the same time we are approaching AAC, which is ASEAN Economic Community. And if we look at all the work that has been done as far as the MDG is concerned, of course we have halved the extreme poverty level. We have increased significantly, even in Asia, in terms of attendance of primary school. So I think you have seen some progress in that area. Now, we understand that now we're moving from the MDG to the Sustainable Development Goal. So I think this is something that in Indonesia, we're trying to put this as basically our aim. Indonesia can be part in achieving these Sustainable Development Goals. And when we look at the three basic components of sustainable development, on the economic growth, on the social inclusion, as well on the environmental sustainability, we see that Indonesia is perhaps one of the countries that is still far behind in this sense. But what we're trying to is now having an alignment between the different component of stakeholders in achieving this. So when we think what kind of growth, of course we no longer focus on just economic growth. So we want to focus on this, but how then we can align between the different stakeholders in Indonesia. So one area that I would like to share is now the government have the National Development Agenda. And we realize that one area, if we want to make this happen on a more concrete programs, is how to bring this SDG inside of our national agenda. So that's what we did. I'm actually the vice chairman also of the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and I've been asked to champion sustainable development actions. And I think one of the areas that is important is this putting this as the national development agenda of Indonesia, and then bringing in some of the programs that we can develop in achieving the SDG. So we are happy now to kind of aim the same goal, you know, and then from the private sector side, we also have created what we call the Vision 2050. Because we look at all this the amount of issue, we see the increase of we will have a bonus demography, and I think globally, as mentioned, we will reach 9.5 billion people, and that's a huge number. So what are we doing in anticipation of that? And I think it is very important because we've been talking a lot about, you know, how we want to go, but it's important that this alignment is taking place, that when we talk about the government, private sector, NGO, academia, we're talking about the same language and we are driving to the same direction. And I think this is where I feel is very important when we discuss, education, when we talk about jobs, when we talk about social security. This all will involve. I mean, it cannot be just a government driving it. It has to come from the multi-stakeholders. And I think enough has been said. And I think we really in Indonesia want to see how we can bring this forward. And we are also integrating with the region. And I think this is why I mentioned about the AAC, because it's part of what we're doing in WEF. And I'm part of the Global Council member of WEF in Southeast Asia. We're trying to facilitate this process as well on the ASEAN integration aspect, because we feel there's a big gap and where the government is sitting right now with thinking that they're achieving 70-80% of KPI. Private sector is lying, thinking that we're only achieving like 10-20%. So how can we then, sit and see what is missing here, And I think definitely the role of WEF is very important in facilitating some of this integration process.
Thanks. I'm interested in this issue of government KPIs. And in your report, Professor Fujun, you mentioned several different alternative indicators that we could be looking at to sort of augment our understanding of how governments are doing at their job of trying to create not just growth, but quality growth. And three of these I noticed were from the World Bank. There's an adjusted net savings indicator, there's a human opportunity index, and there's a shared prosperity indicator. Now, are these the silver bullets that we need to sort of reevaluate government progress on growth?
Well, these certainly are the indicators that we have included in our report. And our report actually starts with a chapter on mutual. And we think it's important because a change in mindset is very important. Growth should not be exclusively driven by efficiency. For a country or for a nation to move forward, they face simultaneously the goal of efficiency, the goal of justice or equity, and the goal of freedom. So if you think of human development, human wellness, social dimensions, economic dimensions, and also be sensitive to environmental quality and security.
Shinhara-san, can we use these indicators in terms of evaluating? I mean, if you were to do your annual analysis of policymakers, would it be possible to incorporate these indexes into their progress in the Article 4 consultations and various meetings?
There are many indexes being developed by various institutions, so each of them has its own good. But overall, I think it is very difficult at this moment to pick up some of the indexes to be used for policy purposes. I just want to emphasize the importance of income distribution. In Asia, for example, Gini coefficient you talked about, income inequality is rising in most of the countries in Asia, especially in countries with large populations. I don't want to pick up names here, and this is the issue that the countries in Asia need to deal with one way or another. Needless to say, this is not the issue particular to Asia. It is the global issue now, and it is at the center of the global public debate at this moment. But this debate applies to Asia as well. If you look at the countries in Asia, the size of the government is relatively small. That means that the role of the government that plays in allocation of income is relatively small compared to other regions. Why is that? I think it is partly the choice of the governments, the choice of the people to have smaller tax revenue, to have smaller size of the government. But at the same time, it has a lot to do with not enough tax revenues, weak tax administration, huge amounts of tax exemptions. What else? Those things, and lots of red tapes, things like that. I think that are discussed among us a very long time. But that is one area. that the governments in this region has to deal with. The other issue that we need to take a look is that fiscal policy plays a big role in addressing the issue of income inequality. In advanced economies, we have enough data to do some empirical studies, but it shows that taxation and income transfer in the area of social programs would reduce the income inequality by 1/3. I don't know how it applies to developing countries at this moment. Fiscal policy plays a big role in addressing the issue of inequality, and that is clearly related to the issue of sustainability. I just want to point out another empirical study that shows that if income inequality is high, and that income inequality is associated with the shorter duration of high economic growth. That means that if you have a situation with high income inequality, you might be able to enjoy a very high growth for a short period of time, but it is not sustainable. It doesn't last for a long period. And that issue is related to, for example, middle income trap and things like that.
Can I add something to that?
Before we do that, let me turn. This is a perfect opportunity to turn to Nishimura-san, because I think Japan is undergoing a very important experiment. It reminds us this is not a developing country issue. This is an issue that developed countries also face, and Japan is undertaking a lot of policies that address exactly what I think you've talked about. And what's interesting also to me is that Japan, which has for decades had a reputation for having one of the most egalitarian societies or homogeneous societies from an income base, it's also seeing a rising income disparity. And now in April, Nishimura-san, I know you raised your value-added tax. And value-added tax, I know, is being considered by the Asian Development Bank, and I believe also by your colleagues at the IMF, as one way to try to increase the tax base and use that money to spread the wealth. So I want to get your perspectives on how that's working out, what your thinking is. It was very unpopular, and a lot of economists worry that this is going to upend your recovery. So is it justified from the point of view of sustainability and sustainable growth from Japan, for Japan going forward?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. So let me talk about first our efforts towards inclusive and sustainable development, growth. So as you said, Japan is traditionally a very inclusive society with a low unemployment rate and small income gap and advanced environmental technology. So now our government is working to enhance this advantage in the new growth strategy. And for example, unemployment rates currently stays at 3.6%, which is relatively low by international standard, partly reflecting the efforts of companies to keep their employees in their own company. The farmers' efforts to keep their employees contribute to the society. But on the other hand, it tends to reduce their profitability. And yes. So now what we are trying to do is to facilitate the transfer of our labor force to new growing industries. Although $1 billion have been spent for supporting companies to keep their employees, now we are changing this allocation of resources so as to spend $1 billion for supporting job creation and labor mobility in the future. And now we are facing the big challenge we are facing is demography. So population is decreasing in the world, but our population is increasing in the world. Population is decreasing, and now our population is 125 million people. But in 2060, naturally it will be 86 million. So it's a big decrease. So we are now thinking how to manage and overcome this challenge. And so what we have to do is increase the female participation in labor force, which is relatively low by the international standard. So we are increasing our social child care services and also supporting the women who want to work and who want to work. So that's a big challenge for us. And we have to implement physical consolidation. So we need to increase consumer tax relatively low in the international standard. We added the tax 3% to 8% in the last month, April. Now the 88%, and we are planning to add 2 more next year, October next year, to 10%. But it depends on whether we increase this another additional 2%. It depends on the economic situations, because we are trying to get out of the deflation, which has been continuing last 15 years in Japan. So we are our economic policy, Abenomics, is trying to get out of deflation and also implement physical consolidation. So it's a tough, narrow path. So we are doing 3 arrows policies. So as you know very well about the Abenomics. So it's a big challenge for us, but what I want to emphasize is innovation, technology, and among them the big, strong resolution, strong intention to reform our society, reform our restructure of our economy. So Prime Minister Abe is showing a very good, very strong leadership, and Japanese people are now our policy, because we are in the deflation long time. So Japanese people understand we have to do new and we have to do challenge. So that's we're trying to do. Yes.
It's a fascinating problem that Japan faces, and one that's very different than most of Southeast Asia, where we have younger populations. Tsunehara-san and Pujin, I want to get you to talk about this a little bit, because you mentioned fiscal consolidation, and we've just seen the Australian Parliament decide to take a path towards fiscal consolidation. But it seems that, and in your report you allude to this, that there is a danger that in trying to maintain a balanced budget and to protect the savings of people my age and above who have saved for a long time and don't want to see that savings inflated away, that we neglect the needs of the growing younger population, more of a problem that Indonesia has. How do we balance this emerging disparity between not just rich and poor, but the old and the young? The needs of the young need inflation, nominal growth in Japan, for example, or faster growth in Indonesia, versus the needs of savers who, like in Japan, are looking now to sort of phase themselves out of the workforce and retire.
Well, there is a long-term issue and a short-term issue. A long-term issue, it would be good to have a balance sheet. But short-term, given the ups and the downs of an economy, fiscal policy need to be counter-cyclical. We do not make an argument, it's cut. But the process should be nuanced, sensitive to the long-term goal, that you have a balanced sheet. Long-term growth should be looked at as a asset management model, you do not look for cash returns by a deep discount on the underlying assets. Now, this is very important. So the fiscal side, we should be sensitive, it should be counter-cyclical. The investment side, good investment, not highly leveraged investment that will have a reasonable return. I mentioned earlier on, if the growth rates of investment is higher than real growth rates, it's problematic. Now, if you look at the case of China, we probably are suffering from that case.
But isn't that what every single fund manager wants to achieve?
Well, it's we need to build a that has to do with the term I give you. It's GIF model, green, inclusive, value, ecosystem, and in that ecosystem, I talk about at the macro level, there should be a better calibration of the role of the state vis-a-vis the role of the market. To elaborate on that side is, now, even when we look at the market, if there's a case where you only have a market for goods and services without a market for factors of production, including capital, factors of production, land, labor, capital, and the political power continue to control factors of production. So this is the institutional environment. In that institutional environment, it will be very easy for someone to get rich very quickly. But that won't allow the whole population to have what we call shared prosperity.
Okay.
So with those kind of skewed institutional environments, it will give two issues. One is the issue of inequality. The other issue is the issue of corruption. So in that GIF model, ecosystem, we need to be sensitive to both the micro ecosystem as well as what I call the micro ecosystem to promote entrepreneurship and innovation.
Is it just a question of having longer time horizons on your return on investment? Is that what we need to focus on? We've talked about that a lot in different meetings. My concern is that most of the things that we're thinking are good for raising equality are issues that we talked about for a very long time. It seems like the issue is really pulling those into standard policy-making agendas, not just sort of talking about improving the environment and getting stakeholder support for it, but actually making it part of the evaluation of policymakers' progress. The other question, and it's a very scary one, I realize, for a lot of people, is it sounds like what you're saying is what we really need is a much more redistributive system. So is the answer just raising taxes, Shinohara-san?
Oh, I can talk about this for an hour.
Please don't. I'll give you 2 minutes.
Redistribution of income can have positive contribution to growth if the design is right. I think that is the conclusion. Redistribution means lots of things, right? Tax system can be designed to be more progressive, right? In order to make redistribution of income, expenditure on social programs, a cash transfer mechanism and things like that will contribute to the distribution of income. The problem is, if the design is not right, it could harm the efficiency of the economy. We have to find a good balance between the efficiency based on the market mechanism and whatever the social value that we have to protect. So in order to do that, it seems to us that fiscal policy plays a very important role. Not just fiscal policy, there are labor market policies and other things, but for example, in this country, in the Philippines, they have introduced a so-called conditional cash transfer mechanism. They will transfer cash to the poor people, conditional upon their children's attendance in school, or they pay regular visit to healthcare services and things like that. It has been very popular in Mexico and Brazil, and the Philippines have introduced that. It is still in the process, in a process of expanding the program. But there are measures like that. If the design is good, that is not harmful to the development of the economy and things like that. The same applies to consumption tax that Mr. Nishimura talked about, value-added tax. Value-added tax is very friendly to economic growth.
I want to stop you there and ask you to explain that in 2 sentences to the room, why, if you talk about the need for progressive taxes, we think of a VAT, a value-added tax, as being a regressive tax by its very nature. Why would you recommend that Asia have more value-added tax? Does it mean we should be paying less income tax? I hope so.
Actually, if you look at the tax structure here in Asia, they rely more on value-added tax than direct tax. So if you look at the countries in this region, especially in ASEAN countries, you might want to recommend that you should rely more on income taxation rather than consumption taxation. But besides that, what I want to talk about is that, of course, value-added tax or consumption tax is regressive, right? It hits the poor more than the rich. But if it is combined with the appropriate social transfer mechanisms, it should be okay. For example, in case of Japan, what they are trying to do is to raise tax revenues by raising the consumption tax and use that revenue for social security programs, right? That is that has an redistributive impact. So how can you combine the tax issue and the spending issue? That is another issue that you have to look into very carefully.
Jeremy, you mentioned that there's an aspect of this in terms of property rights is a very potent too that has contributed to inequality. Can you address that a little bit, the issue of very thorny issue of land title across Asia?
Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is property rights should be, in most cases, an inalienable right. The reality is that in a lot of cases, people can have their land expropriated, and therefore they can't build any security for themselves and for their future. These things have got to be protected. I think the other piece of it is that if you look around the region, there are your ability to own real estate as either a resident or a foreigner is very different depending on where you are, and that has an impact on your ability to provide FDI into that country. And I was in a conversation last night about it in relation to the Philippines and Indonesia, which was interesting because the amount of FDI going into real estate in Indonesia is far greater than the amount of FDI coming into the Philippines because of the land title and what you're able to achieve. At the same time, when you've got very open property rights, the likes of Hong Kong and such like, when everybody's looking to invest in real estate, all of a sudden you create bubbles, and that's what's happened recently in both Hong Kong and Singapore. And they've provided taxes, which in theory is to stymie speculation, and actually, interestingly, it's had, and the idea of that is to then bring down the price, but actually it's had a different impact, which is that it's pretty much stopped any sort of transactions in that space because the entry price is too great. So those two, I think, go hand in hand, it's important that in order to create stability in a property market, those sorts of things are very, very clear, and the more open one can be, the greater chance one has, both from investors and developers because they get security, but also from an occupier base where you can bring to our whole issue around sustainability and best practices from elsewhere in the world into this part of the world. And ultimately, the whole issue of then, better built environments comes about. I think the other piece of it is also a lot of Asian cities, Singapore's a great example, which have done, as a consequence of planning and those best practices, have managed to densify themselves in such a way that actually they're a more sustainable city than a lot of others. Because
densify.
Densification, yeah. I mean, you don't want the urban sprawl that exists because ultimately that uses resources, it takes up time and energy that ultimately if you densify and plan properly, that can be advantageous both to society, to the individuals living in it, but also resources as a whole.
Okay. We want to open it up for questions. I meant to do that a lot earlier, actually. I encourage you to put your hand up and a mic will be sent to you and just inject yourself into this conversation. Otherwise, we would just dominate it. There's a hand over there. Would you like to ask a question or make a comment? Please identify yourself before
Yes,
you do.
thank you very much for the insights. My name's Lauren Anderson. I'm a Sydney global shaper, and I work in the space of collaborative consumption or the sharing economy, which includes businesses like Airbnb or car sharing, and essentially is about increased efficiency of the assets rather than the production of new assets. So I'm wondering, and perhaps the question is mainly to Professor Bujun and Mr. Shinohara, how can we actually look at growth, maximizing the efficiency of existing assets as a stronger contributor to growth as opposed to the production of new assets? And potentially for everyone, in the East Asian region, obviously there is an aspirational wealth mindset. Can a model like collaborative consumption actually overcome this mindset to increase access to things that are needed? Thank you.
Which of you would like to handle that one?
Certainly, though,
Fujun?
certainly these are steps in the right direction. If I say the gift model, these can be under the G green. I mentioned many labor-saving technologies vis-a-vis earth-saving technologies. So the way I look at what you do is earth-saving, institutional technology. We also come up with the term called institutional technology. That's the kind of method that we human beings coordinate our behavior, shape our value, coordinate behavior more towards the green economy. More welcome in a way.
I think it's interesting that the problem that we face with sustainability and equality or income inequality challenges so much of the fundamentals that we've all taken for granted when we're talking about economics for the last 20 years. And one of them is this notion of trade being beneficial for everyone. We probably all remember that, I think it was not even 10 years ago, most of these meetings were met with great protests because there was a movement against globalization and its impact. And yet now we're looking at trade as an aspect that could actually improve or reduce income inequality. This is in your report. But it seems that there's a problem between the way the trade can improve the equality between nations and within nations. It can become a great disruptor, right? And the way it's perceived. And so I actually think, Nishimura-san, you're considering this now, the TPP. Do you think that this has potential to apply a sort of a pressure for reform in Japan that could transform industries and make business more open and egalitarian?
I think TPP is a good momentum for our reform and restructure. And I think trade will increase each country wealth. So and also we develop new rules of intellectual property rights, IPR, and investment protection or government procurement. So it's transparent new rules. So and if some country is not in this kind of global supply chain made by TPP, it will be excluded. It may be excluded of this supply chain. So this country needs to, keep this, accept this new rule. I mean, IPR and investment protection, or and so on. So this TPP is, I think, driving force for developing new rules all over the world, especially Asian and Pacific region.
Faces great opposition among your domestic constituents, no?
Right. But
so how do you better sell the idea that free trade is actually good for you?
Yes, but each country has kind of sensitive issues. So we have to, we need to hear and accept some sensitive issues from each country. So we don't want 100% free and the complete, framework. We need 80% or 85% is fine. So we are now negotiating in the last stage. And please look at the EU. EU is integrated, economically, one area, region. But each country has each culture and each, yes. So we need the economically integration. But each country has each sensitive issues.
Right.
So yes.
It's sometimes hard to keep your mind around, get your mind around this concept of free trade, not sort of leaving people behind that are already disenfranchised or on the wrong side of the income disparity. What is the rationale for why free trade would help this?
Well, theoretically, the benefits we get from free trade is based on the idea of specialization. A more concrete expression of that is comparative advantage of different nations. But one way to look at markets is to look at domestic markets, then you look at the global markets. What's wrong with the concept of comparative advantage is previously we tend to take that advantage as a static comparative advantage. But static has a beauty of elegance, so sort of see a static picture. But what is important is for us to understand that concept as a dynamic advantage. So do you have a comparative advantage? You say yes. Tomorrow, will you have a comparative advantage? You say yes, but less so. But you gain time so that you can learn new tricks. So the world, the economy, the marketplace continue to move forward. So if the thinking is correct, what is important is to have the concept of opening up of market, not open market right away, so that you gain time to adjust your labor skill sets. You are better positioned to have for jobs that have higher value added.
Shinta, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have to say that this issue of nationalism versus regionalism versus globalization, as is definitely very apparent. And when we talk about in the ASEAN context, we're looking into how to do more trade creation rather than trade and I think we're managing in terms of each of the country as a center of excellence of certain sectors, but how then we can create this single market. And I think when we talk about opening market, there is still a very big dilemma in terms of the nationalism itself. That Indonesia, for example, at the moment we're going through, where foreign investors start looking into Indonesia as more protectionist, regulation, trade regulation coming out. Our negative list has just been issued, in which we are closing some of the sectors, all the openings.
Your mining export.
Yeah, and this is a big issue at the moment that we're facing, And on one side, we want to open up. We're negotiating right now CEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, with different countries, Korea, South Korea. EU we are launching with EU, with Australia, and yet we're not ready for that, right? I mean, TPP is very far off, of course, from the agenda, but I think this is a big dilemma that a country like Indonesia is facing. We don't have that kind of concept of what is really the positive impact if we open our market.
Do you think it would have a catalyzing impact in a country like Indonesia? I know Japan and China have often looked at, China would be very interested to get into TPP. It was welcomed, and I think it has an alternative agreement as a result. But they've looked at these agreements as ways that they can say, we had to sign this and now we have to implement reforms that would otherwise be domestically, politically impossible. I'm thinking about, the land acquisition situation in Indonesia has been talked about often as a deterrent to foreign investment, to infrastructure investment. You have a sense of this as a business person and entrepreneur. What's the situation there? Is that getting better? And do you think that there's a way to increase foreign investment by signing on to trade agreements that would help catalyze, get more legislation through Parliament than otherwise would happen?
Yeah, I think of course, as you know, our election is July. So at the moment, everything seems to be on hold. We are very optimistic that the new government hopefully can really, bring us to a new direction of Indonesia, new hope for Indonesia. But I think what is crucial to say is, it seems like there's a number of homework that Indonesia needs to fulfill before we even can look at more opening up of Indonesia. And I think this is really, reflected in the regulatory framework aspect. Decentralization is a very big issue. So while we are talking about globalization, this is a major issue in front of us, which is decentralization, which impact like the land acquisition and so forth is still a big issue till today. So I think unless we kind of address those challenges that we face internally, I think we will continue struggling to want to be a player in this global arena. And I think this, obviously, the timing is very important, and that's why we are looking how this effort can be done simultaneously and address the home issue as well as the global issue. And I think, we need to really, I think Indonesia new government has a very big assignment in their head, so they really have to move forward with this.
Okay. Let's open up to some more questions. I see a couple hands going up. Anyone from the other sections of the right? And I have a whole bunch of people behind me I can't see, so you just have to throw something at me. In the back.
Yeah, my question is for Nishimura-san. And in articles I read about the TPP content, there are extraordinary shareholder rights to ignore laws in member countries related to environmental regulation, to bring lawsuits if regulations are more severe in their home country, to recover lost profits, to challenge labor laws that they don't like. And I don't hear much about that in the debates, and I'm wondering if those issues have been addressed and taken out of the TPP. Japan, with its incredible history of environmental protection, of strong labor laws, is accepting those parts of the TPP agenda that I read about in some of the underground press that we don't talk about publicly. I'm wondering, is TPP really something that you should be moving toward, and how does it address, or how might it impact Japan's environmental record, Japan's labor law going forward?
Good question. And how will it affect, can you identify yourself?
I'm sorry. My name is Alan Miner. I'm a venture capitalist based out of Tokyo.
Okay.
What I can say here is so limited, and also it is sensitive matter. Yes, so let me talk a little bit about this, but may I speak in Japanese, so please put the headphone. Ready? You can understand Japanese? Okay. 言うまでもなく TPP は21世紀型のフレームワークを目指してますので、環境とか労働とかこれまでの通商協定にないそうした新しい項目を付加しようとしています。だからこそこれまでの例がないがゆえに交渉に時間がかかっているという面があります。で、これは12カ国が環境とか労働とかもう21世紀にまさに今日の議論と気を一にしますけれども、新しい貿易投資のルールを決めていこうという中で、合意をして議論をしていますので、一定のルールが貿易投資の中で
There will be a set of rules in investment as well, and that would be a common shared rules 12 member countries would comply with. But then, when it comes to specific rules, what would be the dispute settlement mechanism, and then how much time is allowed for the actual introduction of such set of rules? We are in the midst of negotiation right now. And recently there was a ministerial meeting in Singapore, and to what extent a discussion has been sorted out, and then there will be a chief negotiators meeting in July, and by then all these items will be sorted out. And when the chief negotiators meeting is held in July, all these will be worked on and lead on to the ministerial meeting scheduled to be held in July.
I have the complete message. And there was another question there in the green.
Thank you. I'm Vivian Lau from Junior Achievement Asia Pacific, non-profit organization in 120 countries focused on supporting young people. On the topic of sustainable and inclusive growth, I think Professor Fu, you call for a change of mindset. I think sometimes it's more than just the change of mindset. We need to have the enabling system and process to support that. Now, on the real cost of resources, I think what we are seeing right now is that our current generation is actually getting a discount. Our future generation is going to pay a premium. So I know I have this wild concept that I think would terrify politicians and economists in this room. Is there a chance that we can look at real cost of pricing with a different perspective, really long-term pricing? So maybe it's a new form of GST, but the G and the S stand for global sustainability. We can call it tax because tax is a dirty word. So maybe it's global sustainability fund or something, which means that we should really pay for the true cost so that by the year 2060, future generation, when they look at us in this room, they know that we've done something to support them. I know it's a wild card, and I like to hear comments.
Is it a wild card? I think this, I may be wrong, but I think this is the concept behind the carbon tax, behind carbon trading. And Indonesia, please go ahead.
May I come in on this one? I kind of get where you're going with this. And let's take the issue of water, which is where Wayne started, and you referred to that. Water has many dimensions beyond the economic. There's political dimensions, there's even spiritual dimensions, environmental dimensions. And we see, indeed, water use is unsustainable. We see water tables, if you look at the state of Punjab, for instance, in India and Pakistan, water tables have depleted to a level. The farmers know what's happening. They are sustainable. And we go and talk to them, they tell you, listen, this we know beyond the next 10, 15 years it won't last. But if I don't do this, all my neighbors are going to take the water anyway. Right? The depleting groundwater levels in Bangladesh have led to levels of arsenic in the water supply system that has then entered the food chain and have a huge healthcare cost for humanity. So there is no doubt that there has to be some way of appropriately recognizing this cost that this resource has. Unfortunately, the moment you talk of cost as allocated to a resource like that, the first reaction is always emotional. Yeah? And there's no doubt that water, access to clean, safe drinking water is a fundamental human right. But that usage of water for drinking, for cooking, for personal hygiene is not more than a couple of % of the total freshwater resources we have. The bulk of the resources we have are actually used in agriculture, 70%. And the research seems to indicate that the amount of water used in agriculture is 2 to 2.5 times the physiological requirement of the plants themselves, because of losses due to transpiration, losses because of percolation, and simply overuse of water. So a proper pricing mechanism in some way with communities participating, because they see the cost. Communities, farmers know the cost. Participating in this would definitely go a long way, but it's politically a very difficult transition to make.
No, I think the issue of pricing these commodities would take us about 6 hours to even cover the basic issues.
Absolutely.
But very quickly, I wanted to try to draw you back to something you referred to earlier, which is Fujin talked about, and Shinohara-san's talked about wealth transfers. Is there a way, in the context of your investment, you talked about investment in the rural sector and the agricultural sector, is there a way to get the private sector involved more directly in looking at a longer time horizon for returns and in getting engaged with governments in trying to create these wealth transfers on a commercial level?
Let me give you a simple example, yeah, and then you tell me. And this is an example from our business in Pakistan, right? We have a business that's about 80 billion rupees, Pakistani rupees. Of this 80 billion rupees, where does the revenue go? 80 billion rupees cash. 20 billion goes to farmers directly, wealth transfer, form of cash that is transferred on a daily basis for the milk and raw materials they supply. Another 20 billion goes for other raw materials and packaging materials. 20 billion goes to indirect taxes, transportation, interest costs, etc. And 20 billion that's left over is split three ways between employee salaries, direct taxes, and shareholder profits. Now, if I look at that as a model, as a capitalist, and I put this equation, wealth transfer that's happening into the rural economy, into the hands of individual small farmers, yeah, and the money that's actually being split between direct taxes and profits and employees, this is a sustainable business model because you have wealth transfers integrated into the way you operate. And that is a sustainable business model that we need to work with.
Chinta, what do you think? I want to get your opinion because you're from a country that is still largely rural. Do you think that that resonates with you in terms of a workable business model in Indonesia?
Well, actually, the government has tried, as you know, a few years ago, they tried to reduce subsidy and then creating a program of what we call the wealth transfer, a cash transfer program for for the poor. Unfortunately, it didn't really work very well, and I think this concept of wealth transfer as a model seems to be good, but in actual implementation, it's not as simple as what it is appearing to say. Coming back again on what the government is doing, these policies, I think it has to be clear that, for example, at the moment we're negotiating in terms of the social security for labor, and for employees, and where does the cost go? Okay, and they want to say this is all employer responsibility. So basically, 5%, all employers' responsibility, and so they want to basically the costs will lies on the employers, not the employees, and this is an ongoing problem in Indonesia because you're trying to create policies and that is really pro specific, of course the major population in where the labor is, and then yet it's impacting negative to the employer side, which is a certain segment of the society. So I think how can you create this balance in terms of when we look at the wealth transfer, how can this be implemented properly, and how can you can have a fairness in terms of, yes, of course certain cost needs to go here, but how do you actually execute it, I think is the problem. So
let me stop you there and open up we have time for just one more question, and I want to make sure we do get a couple of those in. And then we'll all be heading off for that. I know everyone's eager to get to the lunch. Over the back.
Thank you. My name is Yosef from the Auckland Hub Global Shapers community. We're talking about ecosystems, and ecosystems come from a natural world, sort of our understanding of a natural world. And ecosystems work towards equilibrium. When you think about growth, have we become overly obsessed with growth that it's affecting us negatively?
Is the question, how do we become so obsessed with growth negatively?
Is our obsession with growth affecting us negatively?
Okay. Eugene, you want to take that one?
Well, that's when we look at the existing model of growth. Well, we do not make a very strong argument against the existing model, but in practice of the existing model, land, labor, capital, land, of course, stands for, it's a more concrete term for the celestial constraints we all face. It's land, including water. In the in the practice of existing model, we have not been sensitive enough to what we call the carrying capacity of Earth. Now, consistent with the economic principles, if resources are limited, there must be better mechanisms for better pricing of those resources. But now we are probably conceptually more clear. The next for us is to communicate that message to governments, to business, to every sector of society, so that we have a better chance for the growth to be more sustainable. Of course, it will be a challenge, but the better to start talking about what we call GIFT model. Green, inclusive, new value, a better ecosystem for entrepreneurship and innovation, so that we have a better chance to survive altogether.
All right, why don't we try to wrap it up there, and I'll try to sum it before we all head out. I think, I'm not sure if your acronym will necessarily take off, but I think the spirit behind it definitely will. There needs to be a clear alignment and a recognition. And I think these kind of conversations will help that to some extent. The governments realize it's not just enough to come up with a positive growth figure, because for years we thought if you can produce the growth, you can stay in power. That's clearly no longer the case. I think every government in the region, from Japan to China to Southeast Asia, recognizes that. Obviously, get more serious about trying to create a more realistic pricing model for scarce resources, a smarter tax structure, some kind of conditional wealth transfers should be explored that can help mitigate the impact of freer trade and developed capital markets. Property rights, I think, is a paramount issue for Southeast Asia and most of Asia. Land reform was never really fully implemented in much of the region. I think in this country in particular, it's a process and hasn't been fully completed. Japan, I think politicians there will also have to engage others in the region about trying to create a better awareness and understanding of why free trade is good. And as our audience suggested, I think that more has to be done to try to not only just explain this to the public, but to find ways to create those opportunities so they can move and adapt and benefit fully from those agreements. So why don't I leave it there? And I'm sorry we had to run out of time, but I know there's a big motion to go to the lunch, the Indonesian lunch. I'll thank the panelists for their time and taking part in their insights, and I'll thank all of you for coming and sharing your thoughts too. Thank you.
And that concludes the plenary session, or the session regarding rethinking economic growth.
You know, JJ, it's really complicated when you think about it, economic growth. And, you know, when you try to rethink it and talking about wealth, you know, how do you really define wealth and wealth transfer and, you know, growing economy and inclusive growth? Where do we,
exactly?
You know, how
That's
do we
the
define
question that comes to mind. That's why there were very active participants during that session, because there was someone who asked whether CCT or the conditional cash transfer was indeed successful as a model for all the other countries in the region. Surprisingly, Robert, one of the participants or one of the panelists answered, the one from Indonesia, said that the concept of wealth sharing and the concept of conditional cash transfer is actually very not good on paper. Yes. But in the actual implementation, she said that much, that Indonesia had quite a hard time implementing the desired results thereof. And so we come to the question of what is indeed wealth or wealth sharing. If I may say my personal piece on this matter, wealth doesn't translate to living comfortably for each individual in a country, but I think it should be the sustainability of each resource or the resources of a country. I don't know if you would agree with me, Robert, on this.
Yeah, well, you know, it does look good on paper, but I guess it's case-to-case basis. In some countries it would work, some countries it won't. Depends on the infrastructure, depends on the culture, and depends on the personalities involved and how, you know, how engaging the government and the public are in terms of trying to really talk about wealth transfer from the top to the bottom. You know, if you look at it on the micro level, you look at a corporation, they say sometimes, you know, if you grow too fast, it's bad. If you grow too slow, it's good. So where's the middle ground?
That's what our leaders should define. But one of the leaders or the participants in that session said that what the region needs, or what the leaders of the region need, is to develop a certain kind of mindset in order for us to have an enabling system and process that is effective in order to bring about a successful wealth sharing for the region. But as what Robert said, I think most of our leaders have to look into how we could start it, and when do we say it's the start, and when do we say that everyone in the region is ready towards wealth sharing.
That's going to be a big challenge when we go through the ASEAN integration, because not everybody's equal in this region. You know, some will be lagging, some will be on top. So how do we do this? How do we help each other gain that momentum, in this ASEAN integration, to get their economies to, get up and running, but also not sacrificing what we call inclusive growth?
All right. Meanwhile, Robert?
Meanwhile, let's then see how our legislators are reacting to the current discussion at the World Economic Forum from our Senate reporter, Sam Ramirez. Sam?
Hosting the World Economic Forum on East Asia opens many doors of opportunities for our country, according to some lawmakers.
Ipakita natin yung kagandahan at mga oportunidad dito sa ating bansa kasi para sa ating mga kababayan din.
Malaking bagay yan. Unang-una ay para tayo makapag-host sa World Economic Forum. I hope that we will be able to showcase what is the best of the country has to offer.
Senate President Franklin Drilon says the said forum is also a platform for Philippine leaders to tell the great comeback story of the Philippine economy and the efforts of the government to better infrastructure and create an environment viable for successful investments. From being the sick man of Asia, the world witnessed how the Philippines transformed into one of Asia's fastest growing economies next to China. But despite the economic growth enjoyed by the country for the past years, the government still faces the challenge of addressing unemployment. In 2013, more than 12 million individuals out of jobs, according to a survey done by the social weather stations. Lawmakers believe there is still so much more to be done. Trickling down the effects of the economic growth to the ordinary one in WANA is one of the challenges that Drilon sees. Aside from inclusive growth, lawmakers see infrastructure, public utilities as among the other aspects that the government has to improve on.
Sa aspeto ng turismo, hindi tayo uusad dyan kung patuloy nating ninineglect yung ating airport. Pangalawa, yung mass transit system natin, yung MRT, yung LRT. Kung di natin inayos yan, how can we attract workers more to the urban centers? Power din, isang malaking issue yan sa mga negosyante.
Hindi naman pwedeng honest and good governance lang. Diba? Poverty alleviation, diba? Yung ating poverty incidence is very high. Joblessness, wala namang bagong trabaho na-create. No? Mula 2010. The problem right now, not only is power generation very expensive in the Philippines, we are now facing a shortage come 2050.
This is the first time that the World Economic Forum on East Asia is held in the Philippines after over 2 decades. For the People's Television, Sam Ramirez.
Thank you so much, Sam. What really struck me in that report regarding the reactions of all these senators?
It's mixed. There's a mixed reaction. Some say, this is a chance for us to showcase the gains, and some say there's still a lot to do.
Exactly, and they have identified the things or some of the components that we need to put our attention on, like infrastructure, tourism, environment,
IT,
mass transport system, power, poverty alleviation. As what Senate President Drilon said, it is our chance to showcase our development growth, but there is much more that needs to be done regarding all of these factors that we need to improve on. Infrastructure, for one. I think one of the highlights is the airport.
Yes.
Because we are...
What Senator Angara, we have to focus on tourism, fix the transit system, the airports, to gain both local and foreign tourists in, to get more economic value.
Exactly, but as the tourists flock to the Philippines, we must also not lose sight of the fact that we have to take care of the environment, garbage management and all that. Meanwhile, we shall pause for a gap. PTV will be with you to cover the World Economic Forum and the more exciting parts as we go on later in the day.